I was 34 in the autumn of 2017 when I rented the cabin. It sat on the edge of Exmoor, far from the villages, hidden by low hills and thick hedges that had grown wild over decades. I wanted quiet. I wanted days where nothing happened and nights where the dark stayed outside. I worked a job that burned my head out, and the idea of a few weeks alone felt like the right kind of empty. The cabin was old but solid. Stone walls, heavy timber beams, a slate roof patched in places with newer tiles that did not quite match. The air inside always smelled faintly of damp wood and cold ash, even when the fire was going. Outside, the land rolled away in uneven shapes, rough grass broken by gorse and rock. A narrow track led to the place, barely wide enough for a car, and once I parked and shut the engine off, the silence felt thick, like a blanket pulled over my ears. The first few days passed slowly. I settled into a rhythm. I chopped wood in the mornings, walked the hills in the afternoon, cooked simple food, and read by the fire at night. There was no phone signal. The radio only worked when the weather was kind. Most of the time, I listened to the wind moving through the grass and the small sounds of the cabin itself. The place creaked when the temperature dropped. The beams made soft clicking sounds as they cooled. Nothing felt wrong. Felt old, but not bad. On the fourth day, the weather changed. A low mist rolled in during the afternoon and did not lift. It pressed against the windows and flattened the distance until the world ended a few feet from the door. The air outside smelled wet and sour, like soil turned over. I remember standing at the window and feeling cut off, as if the cabin had been dropped into a different place without warning. That evening, just before dark, I noticed movement near the far hedge. At first, I thought it was a deer. The shape was wrong, though. Too still, too straight. I watched for a long time, my breath fogging the glass. The mist shifted, thinned for a moment, and I saw her. She stood just beyond the line of stones that marked the edge of the land. She was facing the cabin. She did not move. She was wearing a long coat, dark and heavy, hanging loose on her body. Her hair was dark too, hanging flat and straight, pulled down by the damp air. I could not see her face clearly, only the pale shape of it under the hood of the coat. My first thought was that she was lost. The area had walking paths, and people sometimes wandered farther than they meant to. I waited for her to move, to turn, to do anything that would make sense. She did not. The mist rolled around her legs. She stayed where she was, like she had been placed there. I felt a tightness in my chest that I did not like. I stepped back from the window and told myself not to jump to conclusions. The light was bad. The mist played tricks. I went back to the fire and focused on making tea, keeping my hands busy. When I looked again a few minutes later, she was gone. That night, sleep came in short pieces. Every sound felt louder than it should have. The wind hit the walls and slid along the roof. Somewhere outside, something moved through the grass, slow and careful. I told myself it was an animal. I told myself that again and again until morning. The next day, the mist stayed. It did not lift at all. I walked the edge of the land in the late morning, following the stone line where I had seen her. The ground there was soft and dark. I saw footprints. They were clear, pressed deep into the wet soil. They led from the hedge toward the cabin, then stopped. They did not turn back. They did not continue forward. They simply ended, as if the person had stood still for a long time and then vanished into the air. I felt cold even though the day was not that cold. I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself someone had stood there and then stepped away on harder ground where prints would not show. It was a thin excuse, but it was all I had. In the afternoon, I heard footsteps on the track. Slow ones, careful ones. Gravel shifted under weight. I stood near the window but did not look out right away. My heart beat hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. When I finally looked, she was closer this time, much closer. She stood near the corner of the cabin, just out of sight from the door, as if she knew where the blind spots were. I could see her side now. The coat was old, worn thin at the edges. Mud clung to the hem. One sleeve hung lower than the other, like her arm was bent at a strange angle inside it. Her head was tilted slightly, not enough to seem natural. I waited for her to knock. She did not. I waited for her to call out. She did not. She just stood there, breathing slow enough that I could not see it, watching the cabin as if it were watching her back. Minutes passed. My legs began to shake. I felt stupid standing there, frozen, but I could not make myself move. When she finally stepped away, she did it slowly, 1 foot at a time, never turning her back to the building. When she disappeared into the mist, I realized my hands were clenched so tight they hurt. That evening, I checked every window and door. I moved a chair against the door even though I knew it would not stop anyone who truly wanted to get in. The fire burned low. The light it gave off felt small and weak. I sat awake for hours listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard scratching. It came from the wall near the back of the cabin. Slow, uneven sounds like fingernails dragging across stone. I did not move. I did not breathe. The sound stopped, then started again, a little closer to the door this time. I stared at the dark space beneath the table, my eyes burning from not blinking. Eventually, the scratching stopped. I waited a long time before I moved again. When I finally slept, it was shallow and full of sharp dreams. In the morning, I found marks on the stone. Thin lines, pale against the darker rock, clustered near the doorframe. They were not deep, but they were fresh. I packed my bag then. I did not eat. I did not finish my tea. I loaded the car as fast as I could. As I turned the key, I saw her again. She stood at the edge of the track, blocking the way out. She was closer than she had ever been. I could see her face clearly now. Her skin was pale, stretched tight. Her eyes were wide and unblinking. Dirt streaked her cheeks. Her mouth was slightly open, lips dry and cracked, but no sound came out. I stayed in the car. I did not open the window. I did not get out. I waited. After a long moment, she stepped aside, slow and careful, giving me just enough room to pass. As I drove by, I kept my eyes forward. I did not look at her again. I did not stop until I reached the main road. I drove straight to the nearest town and did not look back once. Later, I reported what I had seen to the local authorities. They told me a woman matching that rough description had been living rough in the area for years. She avoided shelters. She stayed hidden. She watched places more than she approached them. She had frightened other people before. They said she had never hurt anyone. That did not make me feel better. What stayed with me was not the idea of danger in the usual sense. It was the way she stood there, silent, patient, learning the shape of the place I was in. It was the feeling of being studied, of being slowly measured from a distance. I never went back to that part of Exmoor. Even now, years later, when the air turns damp and the light goes flat and gray, I think about that cabin. I think about the footprints that stopped without turning. I think about the marks on the stone. And I think about how some people do not need to break in to make you feel unsafe. Sometimes all they have to do is stand there long enough for you to realize you are not as alone as you thought. I went to the cabin 3 months after my ex-husband died. I had avoided it since the divorce, and even before that I hated the place. He bought it during the last year of our marriage, saying he needed quiet and space. What he really needed was distance from me. When he passed away suddenly, the cabin became mine by default. No kids, no close family left to argue over it. Just paperwork, keys in an envelope, and a place I did not want but had to deal with. It was late October of 2019. The drive took almost 5 hours from where I was living then, heading north into an area with more trees than people. The road narrowed the farther I went. Cell service faded in and out, then disappeared completely. I kept the radio off. The silence felt heavy, like it had weight. I told myself I was just there to clean it out and maybe sell it later. I told myself I would stay one night at most. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick stretch of forest near an old logging road that nobody used anymore. It was smaller than I remembered. One floor, gray wood siding, a metal roof already rusting at the edges. There was no porch, just 2 steps up to the door. The windows were dark. No lights, no movement. It looked empty in a way that felt final. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something sour underneath, like damp clothes left too long. I opened the windows even though the air outside was cold. The cabin had one main room with a small kitchen area, a bedroom in the back, and a bathroom that barely fit a sink and a shower. Everything was exactly how he left it. A jacket hung on the back of a chair. Empty bottles lined the counter. A calendar still hung on the wall, turned to the month he died. I walked slowly, touching nothing at first. The floor creaked under my boots. I kept thinking I heard something else, a softer sound under the noise of my own movement. But every time I stopped, there was nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees outside. I unpacked a few things from my bag and set them on the table. I checked the locks on the windows and door, even though I knew how unlikely it was that anyone would come by. Still, the cabin felt watched. Not in a supernatural way, just in the way you feel when you know someone has been in a place recently, even if you are alone now. As night came, the forest changed. The wind picked up, branches scraped against the walls, and something small moved under the cabin. Probably animals. I told myself that over and over. I cooked a simple meal and ate standing up. I did not want to sit down and get comfortable. I decided to go through his things, start the process I had been avoiding. In the bedroom, his clothes still filled the closet. They smelled like him, a mix of soap and something sharp. I found a box under the bed. Inside were papers, old receipts, maps of the area, and a small notebook. I sat on the edge of the bed and flipped through it. The notebook was not a journal in the normal sense. No feelings, no reflections. Just dates, times, and short notes. Weather conditions, car descriptions, license plate numbers. At first I thought it was related to his work, but the dates did not line up. Some were from years before the cabin was built. Others were recent, just weeks before he died. My stomach tightened. I kept reading. The notes became more detailed toward the end. Paths through the woods, distances measured in steps. Notes about lights at night in places where there should not have been any. I did not see my name anywhere, but the handwriting grew heavier, more rushed, like he was writing under stress. I put the notebook down and listened. The cabin made its normal noises, settling, shifting. Still, I felt like I was no longer alone in my thoughts. I locked the bedroom door before sleeping, something I had never done before in my life. I did not sleep much. I woke up several times, heart racing, convinced I heard footsteps outside. Each time I looked through the window, there was nothing but trees and darkness. When morning came, I felt drained but relieved. Daylight made the cabin seem less threatening, more ordinary. I decided to walk the property line, something I remembered him being very strict about. I followed a faint trail behind the cabin, pushing through brush and fallen leaves. After about 10 minutes, I found something that made me stop cold. A second path, more worn than the first, leading away from the cabin at an angle. It was not marked on any map I had seen. The path led to a small clearing. In the center was a shallow pit, covered with boards and leaves. I did not touch it. I stood there for a long time, listening, trying to understand what I was seeing. There were footprints around the clearing. Not old ones, recent. I went back to the cabin fast, my mind racing. I told myself there was a logical explanation. Hunters, campers, anyone. But the notebook came back into my thoughts, the dates and notes that suddenly made more sense in a way I did not like. That afternoon, I noticed things inside the cabin had changed. Small things. The chair I had moved was back against the wall. The window I left cracked open was closed. I stood in the middle of the room trying to stay calm. I checked the locks again. Nothing was broken. No signs of forced entry. I did not tell myself I was imagining it. I knew better. I trusted my memory more than that. Someone had been inside while I was gone. I packed my bag quickly. I did not bother cleaning or sorting anymore. I just wanted to leave. As I reached for the keys, I noticed the notebook was gone from the table where I had left it. I searched everywhere, hands shaking, breath shallow. It was nowhere. I did not stay another minute. I got in my car and drove until my hands stopped trembling. Once I had service, I called the local authorities and reported what I found. They took it seriously, more seriously than I expected. When I mentioned the pit and the notebook, their tone changed. Weeks later, I learned more than I ever wanted to know. My ex-husband had been involved in something illegal, something that started long before our divorce. The cabin was not a retreat. It was a place to watch, record, and hide. The notebook was part of an ongoing investigation I had never known about. His death had not been as simple as it first appeared. The cabin was searched and sealed. The pit was excavated. I was never told all the details, but I did not need them. I sold the land as soon as I was allowed to. I never went back. What stayed with me was not fear of the woods or the cabin itself. It was the slow realization that I had lived with someone I did not truly know, and that even after he was gone, his secrets still had weight. The night sounds, the moved objects, the feeling of being watched were not ghosts or imagination. They were signs of a reality I had stepped into without meaning to. I sleep better now, far from that place. But sometimes, when the house is quiet, I think about how close I came to staying one more night. And I know, without any doubt, that leaving when I did was the only reason I am still here to tell this story. I was 29 that year, in late October of 2014, when I rented the cabin. It sat alone on a stretch of private land near the edge of a national forest in northern Idaho. The place was cheap because it was off-season and hard to reach. The last 5 miles were a narrow dirt road full of ruts, mud, and fallen pine needles. I wanted isolation. I was burned out from work, tired of noise, tired of people, and convinced that a few quiet days in the woods would reset my head. The cabin was old but not abandoned. It had power from a single line running through the trees and a well pump that screamed every time I used water. The wood siding was gray and cracked. The porch leaned slightly to the left. There were boot marks in the dried mud near the steps, not fresh but not ancient either. I noticed them and ignored them. I always ignored small warning signs back then. Inside, the place smelled like dust, old wood, and mouse droppings. I spent the first hour cleaning surfaces and checking corners. No signs of animals inside, no broken windows, no forced doors. The locks were simple but solid. The nearest neighbor, according to the rental listing, was over 3 miles away. There was no cell signal. I had brought a basic radio, canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, a headlamp, and a handgun I legally owned. I told myself that was enough. The first night was quiet in a way that felt heavy. No wind, no rain, just the deep silence of thick forest. I slept badly, waking up often for no clear reason. Every small noise felt sharp. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped. Something scratched under the floor once, probably a mouse. I kept telling myself that nothing was wrong. The second day, I walked the land around the cabin. The trees were dense, mostly pine and fir, with patches of deadfall and thick brush. There was an old trail behind the cabin that curved downhill toward a dry creek bed. It looked like it had not been used in years, but I found a cigarette butt near a tree about 50 yards in. It was not old enough to be bleached white. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. I heard nothing. That afternoon, clouds rolled in early. The light turned flat and gray. By dusk, it felt colder than it should have. I locked the doors before dark, more out of habit than fear. I cooked a simple meal and sat at the small table near the window. The forest outside turned into a wall of black shapes. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were not close. They were outside, somewhere behind the cabin, slow and uneven. Not the light steps of an animal, too heavy for that. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I stayed still in bed, listening hard. The footsteps moved along the side of the cabin, then stopped near the back wall. I waited for the sound of knocking or a voice. Nothing came. Instead, I heard breathing. Low, slow breathing just outside the wall. The sound was faint but clear in the silence. I felt my chest tighten. I did not move. I did not reach for the light. After a long time, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away. I waited until morning without sleeping. In daylight, the fear felt thinner, but it did not disappear. I checked the ground behind the cabin. Fresh footprints were pressed into the damp soil near the back wall. They were boot prints, large, deep, and pointed straight toward the window of the bedroom. Whoever made them had stood there for a while. I considered leaving right then. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through, someone who got too close by mistake. I packed my bag halfway, then stopped. Pride is a dangerous thing. I unpacked and stayed. That afternoon, I noticed more signs. A tree branch near the trail had been broken recently, sap still wet. The cigarette butt was gone. Something about that bothered me more than if it had stayed. It meant someone had been there again. The second night was worse. The wind picked up and branches scraped the roof. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time they came straight to the front porch. The wood creaked under weight. Someone stood there. I could tell by the way the porch sagged slightly. The door handle moved, slowly, not rattled, tested. I had locked the door. I knew it was locked. Still, I held my breath, waiting for the sound of it opening. It did not. The handle returned to its place. The footsteps moved to the window. A shadow blocked the thin light from the moon. I could not see a face, just a shape close to the glass. I stayed still. Minutes passed. The shadow moved away. I did not sleep at all after that. By morning, my nerves felt raw. I drank coffee I did not enjoy and forced myself to think clearly. The road out was rough but passable. The weather report I heard on the radio mentioned a storm moving in late that night. Heavy rain, possible snow at higher elevations. I decided I would leave after lunch. Around noon, I heard a sound that made my stomach drop. A vehicle, an engine, low and slow, coming down the dirt road. It stopped somewhere out of sight. No door slammed, no voices, just silence again. I stayed inside, watching through the window. After a long time, I saw movement between the trees. A man stepped into view near the edge of the clearing. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, a hood pulled up. He did not wave or call out. He just stood there, looking at the cabin. I could not see his face clearly, but I could feel his attention. He stayed like that for several minutes, then turned and walked back into the trees. I grabbed my bag and started loading my car. My hands shook. I worked fast but tried not to panic. When I went back inside for the last items, I noticed something on the kitchen table. A small pile of pine needles and dirt. It had not been there earlier. Someone had been inside. I locked the door behind me even though it felt pointless. I drove down the road faster than I should have. The sky darkened as I went. Rain started to fall, turning the dirt road slick. About 2 miles out, my car slid and got stuck in a deep rut. The wheels spun uselessly. The engine sound carried far in the quiet forest. I shut it off and sat there, heart pounding. I waited, listening. After several minutes, I heard footsteps on the road behind me. I did not turn around. I grabbed my bag and the handgun and stepped out of the car. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing moved. I decided to walk. The main road was still a few miles away. The rain soaked through my jacket. The light faded fast. I walked with my headlamp on, every sense stretched tight. About half a mile in, I heard movement in the trees beside me, matching my pace. Slow, careful, always just out of sight. I kept walking. I did not run. I did not look directly toward the sound. Eventually, the trees thinned and I saw the reflection of headlights ahead. A paved road. I stepped out onto it, soaked and shaking. The sounds in the trees stopped. Passing trucks slowed and pulled over. I did not speak. I just stood there until the driver waved me forward. I got in and stared straight ahead as we drove away. I reported the incident later. I do not know if anything came of it. The cabin listing disappeared a few months after that. I never went back. What stayed with me was not the fear in the moment, but the quiet planning behind it. The testing of locks, the waiting in the dark, the way someone had watched without rushing, felt deliberate, patient, and human. That is what scared me the most. I rented the cabin because I wanted quiet and distance from people, not because I liked the countryside. It was early October of 2014, the kind of time when the days still look calm but the nights start getting sharp and cold. I was 36 then, tired in a way that sleep never really fixed. I worked too much, drove too much, and felt like I was slowly losing track of myself. The cabin was listed as simple, old, and isolated, sitting on a stretch of farmland that hadn't been properly used in years. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. The drive out there took longer than I expected. Paved roads slowly turned into narrow, cracked ones, then into gravel, and finally into dirt paths with tall grass growing through the middle. Fields stretched out on both sides, flat and empty, broken only by leaning fence posts and dead trees that looked burned even though nothing had touched them in years. The sky was low and gray, and the wind moved through the grass in waves that looked almost like water. I remember feeling watched, not in a dramatic way, but in the same way you feel when you stand in an open place for too long. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a wide field, backed by a line of woods that looked too dense for how small they were. It was older than the photos showed. The wood siding was dark from age and weather, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. One window had a crack running from the corner down toward the center, like a scar. The front porch leaned forward, and one step creaked badly when I put my weight on it. Nothing about it felt welcoming, but it felt solid enough to stay a few nights. Inside, the air smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly sour. The place was one main room with a small kitchen area, a narrow bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it had been added later. There was old furniture that didn't match, a table with deep knife marks, a couch that sat too low, and a bed with a mattress that felt thinner than it should have been. No electricity except from a small generator outside. No internet, no cell service, just silence and the sound of wind pushing against the walls. The first night was quiet enough to feel strange. I cooked a simple meal, ate at the table, and listened to the generator hum outside. The wind picked up after dark, rattling the loose boards on the porch. I noticed scratches on the inside of the front door, low near the bottom, like something had been dragged across it again and again. I told myself it was from a dog or maybe old furniture. I went to bed early, tired from the drive, and slept in short, broken pieces. The second day, I explored the land around the cabin. The field in front stretched far, but it was uneven, full of shallow dips hidden by tall grass. I found rusted farm tools half buried in the dirt, old posts snapped off at the base, and a long strip of ground where nothing grew at all. Near the tree line, I noticed a path that looked pressed down, like something heavy passed through often. It didn't feel old. The grass there was bent but not dead. That night, I heard movement outside after the generator shut off. Not footsteps exactly, more like something dragging or shifting its weight slowly. It circled the cabin once, then again, close enough that I could hear it brush against the walls. I stayed still in bed, listening, my body tight and alert. There were no voices, no animal sounds, just breathing that didn't sound like mine. Eventually it stopped, and the quiet returned in a way that felt forced, like it was waiting. The third day, I found marks on the ground near the porch. Deep impressions, uneven, like boots but heavier, with the heels dug in hard. They came from the field, stopped at the steps, and then turned back toward the woods. I felt a slow, cold fear settle into my chest. Not panic, but something heavier. I considered leaving right then, but I told myself I was overreacting. People wandered land like this all the time. Hunters, locals, maybe someone using the place as shelter. That afternoon, the weather changed fast. The sky darkened, and a steady rain started falling, soaking the field and turning the dirt path into mud. The woods looked darker, closer. I stayed inside, reading and pacing, checking the windows more often than I needed to. The rain covered most sounds, but not all of them. Every now and then, something cut through it, a dull thump, the sound of pressure on wet ground, slow and careful. That night was worse. Something hit the side of the cabin hard enough to shake the walls. Not once, but twice, spaced out like testing. I stood in the middle of the room, holding a flashlight and a kitchen knife that felt useless in my hand. The beam caught the cracked window, and I saw mud smeared across the glass from the outside, fresh and thick. My breathing got shallow, my thoughts scattered. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, the rain had stopped. The field was soaked, the grass heavy and dark. I stepped outside and almost slipped on the mud. The marks were everywhere now, circling the cabin, pressed deep into the wet ground. Some were close to the windows. Others led toward the back, near the generator. The fuel cap was open. I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. I packed my things fast. I didn't clean. I didn't eat. I just threw everything into my bag and headed for my car. When I reached it, my stomach dropped. The front tire was flat, sliced clean along the side. Not torn, not worn, but cut. The other tire was low too, slowly sinking into the mud. I stood there, shaking, the quiet pressing in around me. I tried to walk back toward the road, but the mud slowed me down, pulling at my boots. Halfway across the field, I felt it again, that sense of being watched, stronger now. I turned and saw movement at the edge of the woods, a shape pulling back into the trees, tall, uneven, gone too fast to really see. I didn't chase it. I went back to the cabin, locked the door, and waited. I stayed inside for 2 more days. I rationed food, barely drank, barely slept. At night, it came back. I heard it scrape against the walls, press against the door, stand still for long periods like it was listening. During the day, it stayed just out of sight. I found more marks, deeper now, closer together. The generator was damaged beyond use. I was completely cut off. On the 5th morning, I woke to silence that felt wrong. No wind, no birds. I waited, then stepped outside slowly. The field looked different. The grass near the cabin was flattened, wide paths pressed into it, leading away toward the road. I followed them, my heart pounding, my legs stiff and tired. The tracks reached the dirt path and stopped, mixed with tire marks I hadn't seen before. A few hours later, a farmer driving an old truck came down the path. He stopped when he saw me, mud-covered and exhausted. He helped me get to town, no questions asked. The sheriff later told me the land around that cabin had a history of trespassers, squatters, people living off-grid and pushing others away from what they claimed. One man in particular had been reported for years, known for sabotaging vehicles and stalking people until they left. The cabin was taken off the rental site a month later. I never went back. Even now, when I drive past open fields, I think about how empty land doesn't mean safe land. Some places are quiet because someone wants them that way. I was 29 that year, early fall of 2014, when I decided to build a small cabin by myself on a piece of land I had bought cheap in a rural valley a few hours from the nearest town. The land sat between thick pine forest and a slow river that flooded every spring. I chose it because it was quiet and because I wanted something that belonged to me alone. No neighbors, no roads nearby, no cell service. Just trees, mud, and weather. I had been working on the cabin for 3 weeks already. It was nothing fancy, just a single room, rough pine walls, a low roof, and a small wood stove I planned to install later. I slept in a tent a short walk away while I worked. Every day followed the same pattern. Wake up sore, eat something simple, measure, cut, lift, nail. My hands stayed split and raw from the wood. My shoulders ached every night. But the cabin slowly took shape. That day started normal, but the sky looked wrong. Thick clouds sat low and heavy, gray like wet concrete. The air felt tight and damp, the kind that sticks to your skin. I knew rain was coming, but I wanted to finish setting the roof frame before the weather turned bad. If I didn't, water would soak the interior and warp the boards I had already placed. By late afternoon, the light dimmed like someone turning down a switch. The forest went quiet in a strange way. No birds, no insects. Just wind moving through the trees in uneven bursts. I worked faster, ignoring the growing ache in my lower back. My shirt clung to me with sweat and humidity. The rain started suddenly. Not light rain, not a drizzle. Came down hard, cold, and loud. Big drops slapped against the half-finished roof and turned the dirt around me into mud within minutes. I thought about stopping, but I was too far into it. I told myself I could finish one more section. As the rain got heavier, the sounds around me changed. The forest seemed closer somehow. Every noise carried. The hammer striking nails echoed. Water ran off the roof frame in sheets. The river in the distance grew louder, deeper. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were in the mud near the edge of the clearing, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. I froze when I saw them. They were not mine. I knew my own boot pattern well by then. These were longer, deeper, like someone heavier had walked through recently. The rain was already filling them in, which meant they were fresh. I stood there, rain soaking through my clothes, hammer still in my hand, staring at the ground. I told myself there was a simple explanation. A hunter passing through, someone curious. The land was remote, but not impossible to reach. Still, I felt my stomach tighten. I looked toward the trees. The rain blurred everything beyond 20 yards. The woods looked flat and dark, like a wall. I couldn't see movement, but I felt watched. That feeling crawled up my spine and settled between my shoulders. I went back to work, but slower now. Every sound made me tense. A branch snapping under the weight of rain made my heart jump. Wind moving through the pines sounded like footsteps if I wasn't careful. The rain turned the ground slick. Mud sucked at my boots. When I climbed the ladder to secure a beam, my hands slipped on wet wood. I nearly fell once and had to sit on the roof frame for a minute, breathing hard, rain running down my face and into my eyes. As darkness crept in, the storm worsened. Thunder rolled low and distant. The sky flickered with light far away. I knew I should stop, but the idea of walking back to my tent through the rain and trees felt worse than staying. The cabin, even unfinished, felt safer. I decided to stay inside the structure for the night. I nailed a few loose boards across the doorway, not to lock it, but to block wind and rain. Inside, the cabin smelled like fresh wood and wet dirt. The floor was bare ground covered with scattered planks. Water dripped through gaps in the roof, tapping steadily. I sat on a stack of lumber, listening. The rain drummed on the roof frame. Wind pushed against the walls, making them creak. Every so often, something hit the side of the cabin, maybe branches or debris blown by the storm. My muscles stayed tight, ready to move. Then I heard footsteps, not loud, not rushing, slow and uneven, moving through mud. They stopped outside the cabin, just beyond the wall. I held my breath without thinking. My ears strained to catch every detail. The sound of rain tried to swallow everything else, but the footsteps were real. Weight shifting. Pause. Another step. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly. I didn't turn it on right away. I waited, counting my breaths, hoping the sound would move away. Instead, it circled the cabin. The footsteps went from one side to the other, stopping near the doorway. Mud squelched softly. Whoever it was stood there for a long moment. I imagined a shape just outside, close enough to touch the wall. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. I told myself to stay quiet. No movement, no light. If this was someone passing through, maybe they would leave. I stayed still until my legs cramped and my back burned. The footsteps eventually moved away, fading into the rain and trees. I didn't relax. I stayed awake the entire night. I counted thunder between lightning flashes. I listened to the river grow louder. I flinched at every sound. At some point, exhaustion pulled me into shallow sleep, but it never lasted more than a few minutes. When morning came, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Gray light filtered through the trees. Everything smelled soaked and cold. I stepped outside carefully. Fresh footprints circled the cabin. Clear now in the wet mud. They went right up to the doorway. I followed them with my eyes as they led back toward the forest and disappeared among the trees. There were no tool marks, no signs of someone trying to get inside. Just the prints and the memory of being watched. I packed my gear that morning with shaking hands. I told myself I was being smart, not scared. I loaded everything into my truck and drove to town. I stayed there 2 days, replaying the night in my head, trying to convince myself it meant nothing. On the 3rd day, I went back. The weather had cleared. Sunlight broke through the canopy. Birds were back. Everything looked normal. The cabin stood quiet and empty. No footprints this time. No signs of anyone returning. I finished building it over the next week, but I never stayed overnight again. I installed the roof, sealed the walls, and added a solid door with a heavy lock. Every time I worked there, I felt that same tight feeling in my chest, like the land itself didn't want me lingering after dark. I sold the property the following spring. The buyer asked why I never finished the interior. I told him I had lost interest. That part was true in a way. I had learned something important out there. Being alone doesn't always mean being isolated. Sometimes it just means you're the easiest thing to notice. I still think about that rainy night, not because something attacked me or because something impossible happened, but because nothing did. Someone had been there, someone real, someone close enough to hear me breathe through the wall. That knowledge stayed with me longer than fear ever could. I was a seasonal park ranger in the northern part of Montana in the early 2000s. I was 29 at the time, recently divorced, and I had taken the job because I wanted space and quiet. The cabin they assigned me to sat near the edge of a protected forest zone, far from the visitor center and even farther from any paved road. It was meant for rangers who worked long patrol shifts and needed a place to sleep without driving hours back and forth. The cabin was old but solid, built sometime in the 1950s, with thick logs, a metal roof, and a wood stove that smelled like smoke even when it was cold. My job that season was routine patrol and wildlife monitoring. Most days were long and dull. I checked trail markers, cleared fallen branches, logged animal signs, and kept an eye out for illegal camping. I liked the isolation. The cabin was quiet at night, and the forest felt honest, like it didn't pretend to be friendly. I had been there almost 3 weeks when things started to feel wrong. At first, it was small stuff. Tools were not where I remembered leaving them. A shovel leaning against the back wall would be on the ground the next morning. Boot prints showed up near the cabin that were not mine. I told myself it was other rangers passing through or hikers who wandered too close. The area was supposed to be restricted, but people ignored signs all the time. Still, the prints bothered me. They circled the cabin more than once, and they were always fresh. The cabin had one main room, a small bedroom, and a storage shed attached to the back. The windows were narrow and old, with glass that warped the view outside. At night, the darkness pressed up against them so hard it felt solid. I started locking the door every evening, even though I had never bothered before. I also kept my service radio close, though reception out there was bad. One afternoon, I came back from a long patrol and noticed the cabin door was not fully closed. It was not wide open, just slightly off the frame, enough to let the wind push it gently. I knew I had shut it. I stood there for a long time before going inside. Nothing looked stolen. My bed was untouched. The food box was still sealed, but the air inside felt stale, like someone had been breathing in there recently. That night, I slept lightly. Every sound stood out. The wind in the trees, the scrape of branches, the settling of the cabin as the temperature dropped. Around sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, careful steps moving around the cabin. They were heavy enough to be human, not an animal. I stayed still, listening. The steps paused near the back wall, close to the storage shed. Then they moved away. I did not hear a vehicle, only the forest swallowing the sound. The next morning, I found the shed door open. Inside, a box of old supplies had been moved. Nothing taken, just shifted. I wrote it up in my log, trying to keep my language calm and professional. I told myself it was probably someone living rough, moving through the area, using the cabin as a shelter when I was gone. That thought bothered me more than the idea of theft. Over the next week, the signs got worse. I found cigarette butts near the tree line. I smelled smoke one morning that was not from my stove. Once, I found food wrappers buried shallowly behind the cabin. Whoever it was knew enough to hide signs, but not enough to do it well. I felt watched during the day. The forest that once felt quiet now felt tense, like it was holding its breath. One evening, a storm rolled in fast. Heavy rain, thick clouds, and wind that bent the trees. I decided to stay in the cabin and catch up on paperwork. As it got dark, the power from the small generator flickered and went out. I lit a lantern and kept working. The rain was loud on the roof, steady and hard. That was when I heard the scratching. It came from the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate, not the random noise of branches. It sounded like fingers dragging across wood. I froze, listening. The scratching moved along the wall, then stopped near the window. I stayed still, holding my breath. The rain made everything feel closer, tighter. After a long minute, the sound stopped. I did not sleep that night. I sat with my back against the wall, my flashlight in my hand, waiting for morning. When the light finally came, I went outside and followed the tracks. Fresh boot prints led away from the cabin and into a section of forest that was not on any trail. I followed them until they disappeared on rocky ground. Later that day, I made a decision. I packed what I needed and drove to the ranger station. Even though it was a long drive, I filed a detailed report. The supervisors took it seriously enough to schedule a sweep of the area. 2 days later, we found a makeshift camp less than a mile from my cabin. It was hidden well, tucked into a natural dip in the land. There was a tarp, a sleeping bag, canned food, and personal items. No one was there. What we did find were notes. Not letters, just scraps of paper with dates and times written down. Some of them matched my patrol schedule. Others listed weather patterns. There were rough drawings of the cabin from different angles. Whoever had been there had been watching me for a long time. Law enforcement got involved after that. They expanded the search area. A week later, they found the man living deeper in the forest. He was thin, dirty, and clearly unstable. He had a history of disappearing into remote areas and living off the grid. He admitted to using ranger cabins when he thought they were empty. He never said why he stayed near mine for so long. After that, I was reassigned. I never went back to that cabin. On paper, everything ended cleanly. A report filed, a person removed from the area, a risk addressed. But the feeling never left me. Knowing someone had been that close, that often, without me realizing it fully, changed how I saw isolation. Years later, I still think about that season, about how quiet can hide movement, about how being alone does not always mean being by yourself. The forest did not do anything wrong. It was just there, covering for someone who did not want to be seen. I left that job at the end of the season and never took another remote posting again. Some places are beautiful, but they are not empty, no matter how much they look like they are. I was 29 that year, the fall of 2014, and I had been doing contract work that kept me moving from place to place. I liked being alone back then. It was cheaper, quieter, and I felt like I could think straight when nobody was around. That was how I ended up renting a small, run-down cabin on the edge of a rural graveyard in western Pennsylvania. The listing barely mentioned the graveyard. It just said quiet area, private land, no close neighbors. That should have been a warning by itself. The cabin sat behind a low hill and a line of dead trees. The graveyard was older than the county records, with headstones leaning at strange angles and names worn smooth by time and rain. The cabin had probably once belonged to a caretaker decades ago. It was made of dark wood that had gone gray, with a tin roof patched in several places. There was no cell service. The nearest town was almost 30 minutes away by a narrow road that twisted through woods and fields. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was low and dull, the kind of gray that makes everything look flat and heavy. I remember noticing how quiet it was. No traffic, no voices, just the sound of wind moving through dry grass and the occasional creak from the trees. The graveyard started about 50 yards behind the cabin. There was no fence separating them, just a rough stone wall that had collapsed in spots. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and something faintly rotten. The furniture was basic and old. A small table, 2 chairs, a couch with a blanket folded on one arm, and a narrow bed in a back room. There was a wood stove and a stack of logs outside. Everything looked untouched, like nobody had stayed there in a long time. I told myself it was fine. I had stayed in worse places. The first night passed without much trouble. I cooked canned food, read by lantern light, and went to bed early. The silence was thick, felt like the air itself was pressing in. I remember waking up once to the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin, like branches scraping the wall. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The second day, I explored the area a bit. I walked through the graveyard during daylight. The ground was uneven, soft in places where it had sunk over time. Some graves were marked with wooden crosses that had gone black with age. Others had stone markers cracked straight down the middle. A few had no names left at all, just shapes and rough dates. I noticed several newer graves near the far end, maybe from the last 10 or 15 years. That surprised me. I hadn't expected the place to still be used. Behind the graveyard was thick forest. No trails, no signs, just trees packed tight together. The air felt colder there, even in the afternoon. I didn't go far. Something about it made my chest feel tight, like I was being watched, even though I knew that was probably just my nerves. That night was when things started to feel wrong. I woke up to a dull sound, steady and slow. Took me a moment to realize it was metal hitting stone. Not hard, just enough to make a soft, repeated clink. I lay still, listening. It was coming from outside, somewhere near the graveyard. I checked my watch. It was a little after 2 in the morning. I told myself it was probably someone working late, maybe fixing a marker or dealing with damage. Still, the idea of someone out there at that hour didn't sit right with me. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound move closer, then farther away. After maybe 20 minutes, it stopped. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I found fresh dirt near one of the newer graves. The ground looked disturbed, like someone had been digging and tried to smooth it over afterward. There were footprints too, leading toward the trees behind the graveyard. The prints were deep, made by heavy boots. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the woods. I thought about leaving then. I really did, but I had already paid for the week, and part of me felt stupid for being scared. I told myself I was overreacting. People did strange things in rural places. It didn't mean anything bad was happening. That afternoon, I noticed the cabin door didn't shut the same way anymore. It stuck slightly, like it had been forced or pushed. I checked the hinges and the frame. Nothing looked broken, but the wood around the latch was scraped and lighter in color, like something had rubbed against it recently. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I heard footsteps circling the cabin just after midnight. Slow, careful steps. Whoever it was didn't rush. They walked around the cabin more than once. I could hear the soft crunch of gravel and leaves under boots. At one point, something pressed against the wall near the window, enough to make the glass rattle. I stayed still, barely breathing, my eyes locked on the dark shape of the door. No knocking, no voices, just movement. Eventually, the steps moved away toward the graveyard. I waited for hours before I dared move. When the sun finally came up, I felt sick with exhaustion. In the daylight, I found more signs. Mud on the steps, a long scratch down the side of the cabin, like someone had dragged a tool or piece of metal along the wall. Near the stone wall by the graveyard, I found a shovel leaning against a tree. It was old but solid, the blade still sharp. That was the moment I knew something was seriously wrong. I packed my things quickly. I didn't care about finishing the week. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded my car, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. One of the newer graves was open. The dirt had been moved aside, and the wooden coffin inside was broken. The lid was cracked inward. There was no body inside. I got in my car and started driving. About halfway down the road, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the trees near the graveyard. Tall, wearing dark clothes, completely still. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again. I reported what I saw to the local police once I reached town. They took my statement seriously, more seriously than I expected. They didn't look surprised. One of them mentioned, without going into detail, that there had been problems in that area before. Grave disturbances. Illegal burials. people living off the grid who didn't want to be found. A few weeks later, I read a short article online. A man had been arrested in connection with several stolen bodies from rural graveyards. He had been living in a makeshift camp deep in the woods, using old cabins and abandoned structures to hide. The article mentioned the graveyard by name. I never went back to that place. I never tried to get my money back. Even now, years later, I still think about how close I was to staying one more night. I think about how quiet the cabin was, how easy it would have been for someone to get inside without making a sound. There were no ghosts out there, no curses or stories passed down through time. Just a man, a graveyard, and a cabin that should have stayed empty. That makes it worse somehow, because it was real and it happened, and I walked away before it was too late. I was 34 years old in the fall of 2012 when I decided to take a week off and drive north to a hunting cabin I had access to through an old family friend. The place sat deep in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, surrounded by state land and thick forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I had hunted my whole life and spent plenty of nights outdoors, so being alone didn't bother me. I actually liked it. I liked the quiet, the slow pace, and the feeling that nothing existed beyond the trees. The cabin itself was small and rough. One room, a narrow sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a table made from old planks. It smelled like damp wood, metal, and old smoke. There was no electricity and no running water. A rusted hand pump stood about 50 yards behind the cabin, near a muddy clearing. The nearest town was over an hour away by truck, and once you turned off the main road, it was nothing but logging trails and washed-out paths. There was no cell service. I knew that before going in, and I was fine with it. The first 2 days were calm. Cold mornings, fog hanging low between the trees, frost on the ground. I hunted deer during the day and cooked simple meals at night. Canned food, jerky, coffee boiled on the stove. At night, the forest made its usual sounds. Wind in the branches, leaves shifting, distant animals moving through the dark. Nothing out of the ordinary. On the third night, things changed in a way that was subtle at first. I noticed tracks near the cabin when I came back before sunset. Not deer tracks, not bear. They were boot prints. Deep, heavy, like someone wearing work boots. I stood there for a long time looking at them. They came from the tree line and stopped near the side of the cabin. Then they turned back the same way they came. I knew they weren't mine. I had worn different boots, and my tracks went a different direction. I told myself it could be another hunter passing through. The land was public. Still, something about it bothered me. No one had reason to come that close to the cabin unless they knew it was there. I checked around the windows and door. Nothing was disturbed. The lock was still in place. That night, I slept lightly. The cabin made noise as it always did. Wood popping from the stove cooling down. Wind pushing against the walls. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized the forest was quiet. Not normal quiet, but empty. No insects. No distant movement, just silence pressing in. I lay there listening, my heart slowly speeding up. After a few minutes, I heard something outside. Footsteps, slow and careful, not the random movement of an animal. These were controlled, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I stayed completely still. I didn't move my head. I didn't reach for my rifle. I just listened. The steps stopped near the front door. I could hear breathing, shallow, slow breathing, close to the wall. Whoever it was didn't try the door. They didn't knock. They just stood there. After what felt like a long time, the steps moved away and faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside as soon as it was light. More boot prints were in the dirt, fresh ones. They circled the cabin. Someone had stood near the windows. I saw marks in the mud where they had shifted their weight, like they were leaning in to look inside. I felt exposed standing there in the open, so I went back in and packed my rifle with me for the day, keeping it close instead of slung over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone while hunting, but I felt watched. Every sound made me turn. Every shadow between the trees seemed too still. When I came back that evening, I noticed something new. A small pile of sticks arranged near the tree line. Not random, placed carefully. I didn't recognize it as any hunting marker or trail sign. Felt like it was meant to be seen. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they came closer. I heard them on the porch. The wood creaked under weight. Something brushed against the door. Slowly, the handle turned just enough to test it. The lock held. My hands were shaking as I held my rifle, aimed at the door, waiting. Nothing happened after that. The steps eventually moved off again. By the fourth day, my nerves were shot. I considered leaving, but pride and stubbornness kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just someone messing around. Still, I made changes. I moved my truck behind the cabin so it couldn't be seen from the trail. I stacked wood against one window to block the view. I kept the rifle with me at all times. That afternoon, I found something that removed any doubt that I wasn't alone. Near the hand pump, I saw fresh footprints and cigarette butts pressed into the mud. Someone had been standing there for a while, watching the cabin, waiting. The realization hit me hard. Whoever this was knew my routine. They knew where I slept. They knew when I left. They had been close enough to study the place without being seen. The forest suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the trees were leaning in. That night was the worst. The steps didn't circle the cabin. They approached straight from the woods. Heavy, confident. The porch creaked again. This time, something scraped along the wall, slow and deliberate. Then came knocking. Not loud, not aggressive, just firm taps against the wood, spaced out, like someone testing my reaction. I stayed silent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe louder than necessary. The knocking stopped. Then I heard the sound of something metal dragging lightly across the door. A long, slow scrape. I felt sick. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. After that, the steps moved to the side of the cabin, toward the window I had blocked. I heard would shift as pressure was applied. The stacked logs held. Whoever it was let out a slow breath, loud enough for me to hear through the wall. At some point before dawn, everything stopped. I didn't wait for daylight. I packed what I could with shaking hands, moving as quietly as possible. I opened the door just enough to step outside. The forest looked the same as always, but I knew better. I knew someone could be standing just beyond the trees. I made it to my truck without incident and drove out fast, not stopping until I hit the paved road. When I reached town, I went straight to the local sheriff's office and reported everything. Tracks, footsteps, knocking, the marks on the cabin. They checked the area later that week. They found signs of someone camping illegally a mile away. A small fire pit, trash, food wrappers. No identificación. No one was ever found. The deputy told me it wasn't uncommon for drifters or people avoiding others to hide deep in the woods. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of someone watching me sleep, testing the door, learning my habits, stayed with me. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like a place where someone could be close, unseen, for a very long time. Even now, years later, when I think about that week, what scares me most isn't what happened, it's what didn't. Whoever was out there had plenty of chances to do more. The fact that they didn't is the part one still don't understand. I was 34 when this happened, in late October of 2018. I had rented a small hunting cabin in eastern Utah, far from towns and paved roads. The place sat in a shallow valley with low hills and dry trees around it. No neighbors, no cell signal. I wanted a quiet week to clear my head after months of stress and bad sleep. I told myself the isolation would help. The cabin was old but solid. One room, a small porch, a wood stove, and a metal roof that popped when the temperature dropped. The nearest dirt road was almost 2 miles away. There were old game trails around the cabin and plenty of animal signs. Deer tracks, coyote scat, and bones picked clean by something patient. That didn't bother me at first. It was normal for the area. The first day passed without anything strange. I unpacked, stacked firewood, and walked the area before sunset. The land felt empty in a heavy way, like sound didn't travel far. Even my footsteps seemed swallowed by the dirt. At night, the wind moved through the trees and made slow scraping sounds on the roof. I slept lightly but without fear. The second night was when things shifted. I woke up around 2 a.m. because the cabin felt different. Not colder or louder, just wrong. The air felt thick, like before a storm, but the sky was clear. I lay still on the narrow bed, listening. That was when I heard something moving outside. It wasn't fast. It wasn't heavy. It sounded like bare feet on dry leaves, slow and careful. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I waited for an animal sound, a snort or a cough or claws on wood. Nothing came, just silence that pressed on my ears. I told myself it was a deer or a stray dog. I stayed in bed until the sound faded. When morning came, I found tracks around the porch. They didn't look right. They were uneven, like someone trying to walk quietly but not used to it. The heel marks were deep, the toes shallow, too long for an animal, too wide to be normal footprints. I felt a small knot of worry, but I pushed it down. People wander sometimes. Hunters, drifters, locals cutting through land that isn't theirs. I locked the door and kept my rifle close after that. The third day, I noticed something else. The wildlife went quiet. No birds, no distant howls. Even the wind seemed to avoid the valley. Around sunset, I found a dead deer about 100 yards from the cabin. It wasn't eaten, just opened and left there. The smell was sharp and wrong, like the body had been torn without purpose. That night, the steps returned. They came closer this time, slow circles again, then stopping at the wall near my bed. I could hear breathing, not panting like an animal, controlled, steady breaths through a nose that sounded partly blocked. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps shifted, then moved away. After a long time, I slept again. The fourth day was when fear fully set in. I woke up to scratches on the cabin wall, just below the window. Long lines dug into the wood. Not claws, not knife marks, more like fingernails dragged with force. The window itself was smeared with something dark and greasy. I didn't touch it. I packed my things halfway, telling myself I would leave after one more night. Pride played a part. I didn't want to believe I was running from shadows. I convinced myself there was a logical answer. That afternoon, I walked farther than before, following a dry creek bed. I found signs of someone living rough. A pile of bones stacked neatly, strips of hide hanging from a tree. No tools nearby, no campfire, just remains arranged in a way that made my stomach turn. It looked practiced, intentional. On the way back, I felt watched, not in a vague way, in a focused way, like eyes locked on my back. I turned several times and saw nothing. Still, the feeling didn't fade until I reached the cabin. That night, the sounds started earlier, before full dark. Slow movement again, but closer. Then something new, scraping along the roof. Weight shifting above me. The metal creaked softly. Dust fell from the ceiling. I sat on the bed with the rifle in my hands, safety off. My heart beat so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept my eyes on the door, waiting for the handle to move. Instead, I heard a sound I can't forget. A voice trying to shape words but failing. It wasn't loud. It was right outside the wall. The tone rose and fell like speech, but the sounds were wrong. Broken. Bit. Like someone who learned language by listening, not speaking. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voice moved around the cabin, changing pitch, repeating fragments. At times it almost sounded like my own breathing echoed back to me, delayed and twisted. Then came the smell. Rot and sweat mixed together. The door shuddered once, hard enough to rattle the frame. I raised the rifle and aimed. The roof creaked again, heavier this time. Something dropped onto the porch. The steps came fast now, uneven, slapping wood and dirt. The door handle moved slowly, testing. I didn't fire. I don't know why. Maybe fear froze me. Maybe instinct told me noise would make it worse. After a long stretch of time, everything stopped. No steps, no voice, just the sound of my own breathing and the stove ticking as it cooled. I didn't sleep at all. First light, I left. I didn't pack neatly. I didn't clean. I grabbed what I could and stepped outside with the rifle ready. The porch boards were cracked. The roof edge was bent downward in one spot, like something had hung from it. Near the tree line, I saw movement, a shape half hidden behind a tree. It stood upright but wrong, leaning forward too much. The limbs looked uneven, like joints didn't line up right. The head tilted in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't chase me. It watched. I walked backward to my truck, never turning my back. When I reached the road, I drove without stopping until pavement appeared and my hands stopped shaking. I reported what I found to local authorities, leaving out parts one knew would sound insane. They checked the area. Later, I was told they found signs of an illegal squatter camp and animal remains. No person was located. People will say it was a feral human, someone living too long alone, copying sounds, wearing hides, losing shape in the mind and body. That explanation makes sense on paper, but I know what I heard. I know the way it moved. I know how it watched without blinking. I never went back to that cabin. I avoid places like that now. Empty land where things can live unnoticed for too long. Whatever it was, human or not, it knew what I was. And it knew I knew it was there. That is what still bothers me the most. I still remember that week like it never really ended. Even now, years later, the smell of wet pine and old wood can bring it all back in a second. This happened in the fall of 2014, when I was 32 and working a job I already hated but needed badly. My boss at the time was a man named Daniel. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, quiet in a way that never felt calm, and always watching more than he spoke. I had worked under him for almost 3 years, and I never once felt like I truly knew him. The company owned a small piece of land up north, far away from towns or paved roads. There was an old cabin on it that was used for storage and sometimes for planning retreats that never actually happened. One morning, I was told I had to go there with my boss for a few days to inventory equipment and clean the place up for a possible sale. I didn't like the idea, but I didn't have a real choice. Saying no would have cost me my job. The drive itself felt longer than it should have. We left before sunrise, and the city slowly faded into empty roads, then gravel, then nothing but trees. The cabin sat deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. No nearby houses, no cell service. The kind of place where sound feels swallowed the moment it leaves your mouth. The sky was gray and low, and the air smelled like damp soil and rot. The cabin looked older than I expected. The wood siding was darkened with age, and parts of the roof sagged slightly. The windows were dusty and streaked, like they hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Inside, the air was cold and stale. It smelled like mold, old paper, and something metallic. There was no electricity, just a small generator outside and a propane heater that barely worked. From the start, something felt off. My boss moved through the cabin slowly, touching things, checking corners, opening drawers that didn't need opening. His face stayed blank, but his eyes were always active. I tried to focus on the work. Boxes of old files, broken tools, rusted shelves. Everything was coated in dust. My hands stayed dirty no matter how much I wiped them on my pants. As the first day went on, the light outside faded faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of it, and by late afternoon the cabin already felt like evening. The generator made a low, uneven noise that echoed through the walls. Every so often I heard movement outside, branches snapping, leaves shifting. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer or raccoons. Still, my body stayed tense. That night I couldn't sleep. The floorboards creaked with every small shift of weight. The wind pushed against the cabin, making it groan softly like it was tired. My boss stayed awake late, moving around quietly. I could hear his boots on the wood floor, slow and steady. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to his steps and wondering why he wasn't sleeping. The second day was worse. The weather turned colder, and rain started in the afternoon. Not heavy rain, just a constant, soaking drizzle that never stopped. The ground outside turned soft and muddy. The trees looked darker, closer somehow. Inside the cabin, the damp air made everything feel heavier. Papers stuck together. Wood felt swollen. The smell of mold grew stronger. I started noticing small things. Supplies that had been in one place were suddenly somewhere else. A tool I remembered setting down would be gone, then show up later in a different room. At first, I blamed my own memory. Stress does that. But the feeling that I was being watched never went away, even when I was alone. That afternoon, while moving a stack of old crates in the back room, I found a trapdoor in the floor. It was hidden under a torn rug and layers of dust. The wood around it was scratched and worn in a way that didn't match the rest of the cabin. It looked used, recently used. My stomach tightened as I stared at it. I didn't open it. I covered it back up and stepped away, trying to calm my breathing. As night came again, the rain grew heavier. The sound on the roof was loud and constant, making it hard to hear anything else. The generator failed just before midnight. The cabin went dark, except for a weak lantern. Shadows stretched along the walls. The cold crept in fast. My boss stayed awake again, moving around, checking the doors, standing near the windows for long periods of time. I started to feel trapped. The road back was mud now, nearly impossible to drive through safely in the dark. Even if I wanted to leave, I couldn't. My phone was useless. No signal. No internet, just me, my boss, and the woods pressing in from every side. Sometime during the night, I heard movement beneath the floor. Not animals. It was too slow, too steady. A dragging sound, like something heavy being shifted. I froze in place, every muscle tight. The sound stopped after a while, but the silence that followed was worse, thick and heavy. The next morning, I found fresh mud on the cabin floor, boot prints that didn't match mine. They led toward the back room, right where the trapdoor was. My chest felt tight as I followed them with my eyes. I knew then that something was very wrong, and that it had nothing to do with the woods. Later that day, while my boss was outside, I forced myself to open the trapdoor. The hinges barely made a sound. A narrow set of wooden steps led down into a small space under the cabin. The air was colder there, damp and sharp. I didn't go all the way down. I didn't need to. I could see enough from the top. There were restraints bolted into the beams. Old ones rusted and newer ones too. Stains darkened the dirt floor. Tools lay neatly arranged along one wall, clean in a way that didn't belong in a place like that. My hands started shaking so badly I had to grab the edge of the floor to steady myself. I closed the trapdoor carefully and covered it again. My mind raced, but one thing was clear. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave soon. That evening, the rain finally slowed. The road wouldn't stay passable for long. I packed my things quietly, keeping my movements slow and normal. When my boss went into the back room, I took my chance. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside, my boots sinking into the wet ground. The drive out was terrifying. The truck slid more than once, tires fighting the mud. Trees blurred past in the fading light. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands aching from gripping the wheel too hard. I never went back. I reported what I found anonymously weeks later, once I felt safe enough. The company sold the land not long after, and my boss disappeared from the public side of the business. I quit that job within a month and never looked back. The cabin still exists somewhere out there, rotting slowly in the woods. I don't know what was truly done beneath it, or how long it had been happening. What I do know is that fear doesn't always come from shadows or stories. Sometimes it comes from the people you think you know, in places where no one can hear anything at all. I went to that cabin in late October of 1998. I was 32 years old and working seasonal jobs that kept me away from cities. That year, I took a short contract to check old forestry cabins in a stretch of mountains that most people forgot about. The place sat deep in a national forest in eastern Kentucky, far from paved roads. The cabin was not meant for comfort. It was there for storage and for workers who needed shelter during storms. I planned to stay 3 nights, take notes, fix what I could, and leave. The drive-in took most of a day. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to nothing that felt like a road at all. Trees leaned in close, branches scratching the sides of my truck. There was no cell service for hours. The air smelled wet and cold, like leaves that had been rotting for years. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than I expected. 1 room, gray wood, a rusted metal roof, and a small porch that leaned slightly to the left. The forest around it was thick and quiet in a way that made every small sound feel louder. I unlocked the door with a key from the office and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dust, old wood, and mouse droppings. Light came through 2 small windows, both cloudy with age. There was a table, a narrow bed, a propane stove, and shelves built into the wall. Everything felt old but solid. I walked the edges of the room, checking for leaks, loose boards, signs of animals. I found nothing fresh. No food scraps, no bedding disturbed. It felt empty in the way a place feels when it truly has not been used in a long time. I unpacked my bag and set my tools on the table. Outside, the sun was already low. Shadows stretched between the trees, long and thin. I made a simple meal and ate in silence. The forest stayed still, no wind, no birds, no insects. That quiet pressed in on my ears. I told myself it was normal. Remote places are often quiet. Still, I kept catching myself listening harder than I needed to. That night, I slept lightly. The bed creaked when I shifted. The roof made soft popping sounds as it cooled. Sometime after midnight, I woke up for no clear reason. My eyes were open before my thoughts caught up. The cabin was dark except for faint moonlight through the window. I lay still, listening. After a long moment, I heard a sound outside. It was slow and careful, like footsteps trying not to be heard. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping, then starting again. I stayed flat on my back, breathing shallow, telling myself it could be a deer. But deer move differently. They snap branches. They do not circle. The sound stopped near the porch. The wood outside creaked under weight. I felt my stomach tighten. I waited, counting my breaths. Nothing else happened. After a long time, the porch creaked again. Then the sound moved away into the trees. I did not sleep much after that. In the morning, daylight made me feel foolish. I stepped outside and walked the ground around the cabin. The earth was soft from recent rain. Near the porch, I saw prints. They were human. Boot prints, worn soles, heading toward the trees and then gone where the ground turned hard. I stood there longer than I should have. This area was not meant for hikers. It was not near any trail. I told myself it could be an old print, but the edges were too sharp. I spent the day working inside, fixing a loose shelf, patching a small gap near the stove vent. I kept glancing at the windows. Every time the light shifted, my body tensed. The forest stayed quiet again, almost too quiet. No planes, no distentengens, nothing. That afternoon, I found something else. Behind the cabin, tucked near a fallen log, was a pile of trash. Old food cans, a torn tarp, a cracked plastic jug. It was not new, but it was not decades old either. Someone had been using this place or the land around it. The trash had been hidden, not dumped. That detail stayed with me. The second night felt heavier. The air turned colder, and a thin fog crept between the trees. I locked the door and checked the windows twice. I kept my flashlight close. Sleep came in short pieces. Sometime before dawn, the sound came back. Footsteps again, closer this time. They stopped right outside the wall near my head. I could hear breathing through the thin wood, slow and controlled. The sound of a hand brushing the wall followed, fingers dragging lightly, testing. I felt frozen, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The door handle moved slightly, just enough to make the metal click. The lock held. The handle went still. After that, nothing happened for a long time. When the footsteps finally moved away, they did not rush. They faded slowly, like the person knew I was listening. Morning came gray and damp. I packed my bag right away. I told myself to leave early, cut the job short, report what I found. Before I could load the truck, I noticed something new. Near the side of the cabin, a small pile of dirt had been disturbed. When I moved closer, I saw the edge of a shallow hole, covered loosely with leaves. Inside was a blanket, stained and damp, and a few personal items. A broken watch, a folding knife, a notebook filled with scribbles and dates. The dates were recent. I did not look long. My skin felt tight, like it was trying to crawl off my body. I loaded my truck fast, hands shaking. As I pulled away, I watched the tree line in the mirror. I half expected someone to step out, to chase, to wave. Nothing happened. The forest swallowed the cabin again. The drive out felt endless. Every bend in the road made me slow down, ready to stop if something blocked my way. When I finally reached a paved road and found a phone, my relief felt weak compared to the fear still sitting in my chest. I reported everything. The prints, the trash, the hole. I gave exact directions. Weeks later, I heard back. Rangers found a man living off the grid in that area. He had been using old cabins, watching workers, moving when people came too close. He had a history of violence and had skipped parole years earlier. They arrested him without trouble. He was alone when they found him. I never went back to that cabin. The job ended and I took work elsewhere. But even now, years later, I think about how thin the walls were, how close he stood while I lay there, pretending to sleep. What stays with me most is not what he did, but how patient he was, how long he watched, how easy it would have been for things to end differently if a lock failed or if I had stepped outside at the wrong time. That cabin still stands, last I heard, empty again, just wood and nails in the trees. But I know how easily a place like that can stop being empty, and how quiet danger can be when it does not need to rush. I was 37 years old in the fall of 2014 when I rented a small cabin in northern Idaho. It sat on a stretch of old forest land not far from the Canadian border, surrounded by thick pine trees and low hills that stayed dark even in the middle of the day. I wanted time alone. I had just left a long job that burned me out, and I thought a quiet place would help me reset my head. The cabin was cheap, old, and far from town, which felt perfect at the time. The drive there already felt wrong. The paved road turned into gravel, then dirt, then something closer to a logging trail. My phone lost service early, and the radio turned to static. The trees closed in tight on both sides, tall and thin, with no space between them. I remember noticing how few houses there were, not abandoned ones, just nothing at all. No mailboxes, no fences, no signs. It felt like a place people passed through but never stayed. The cabin itself was smaller than the pictures. One room, a narrow bathroom, a wood stove, and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. The wood was gray and dry, with deep cracks from years of weather. There were scratch marks on the door frame that I assumed came from animals. The windows were thick and old, wavy glass that bent the view outside. Everything smelled like dust, damp wood, and cold air that never fully left. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, cleaned a little, stacked the firewood I found under the porch, and walked the tree line around the cabin. The forest was dense and uneven. Fallen branches covered the ground, and the soil felt soft and unstable, like it had been disturbed many times. I saw no clear trails, only broken brush and old tire marks that disappeared into the trees. That stuck with me. This place wasn't as unused as it looked. That night came early. The sun dropped behind the hills before 6, and the cabin went dark fast. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the low popping of the wood stove. I slept lightly, waking up every time the fire shifted or the building creaked. I told myself it was normal. Old places always made noise. On the second day, I noticed small changes. The firewood stack I had made looked slightly off. Not knocked over, just different, like someone had taken a few pieces and tried to put them back. I checked the ground for tracks but saw nothing clear. The dirt was too mixed with needles and leaves. I convinced myself I misremembered. Later that afternoon, I found something behind the cabin near the tree line. A shallow hole in the ground, recently covered with loose dirt and pine needles. It was not deep enough to be a grave, but it wasn't natural either. The soil was darker and damp underneath, and it smelled sharp, like metal and rot mixed together. I filled it back in and told myself it was an animal cache, though I had never seen one shaped like that. That night, I heard movement outside after midnight. Slow steps, careful and spaced out. Not the fast, light movement of deer. Not the heavy crash of a bear. It sounded controlled. I stayed still in bed, listening. The steps moved around the cabin, paused, then continued. The porch boards creaked once under weight, then went quiet again. I waited a long time before the sounds faded back into the trees. The next morning, I found mud on the porch boards, fresh and dark, pressed deep into the wood grain. The shape was wide and uneven, like a boot that had been worn down over years. There was only one clear print. Whoever made it had stepped carefully, placing weight once, then lifting off clean. I should have left then. I knew that, but I didn't. I told myself it was probably the property owner checking on the place or someone passing through. I had already paid for the week. Pride and stubbornness kept me there. Over the next 2 days, the forest started to feel closer. The silence became heavy, like pressure. Birds stopped making noise when I stepped outside. I noticed the same feeling while walking near the tree line, like being watched from multiple angles. I stopped going far from the cabin. I locked the door even during the day. On the 4th day, I found a trail I hadn't seen before. It started about 50 yards from the cabin and ran straight into the trees. The ground was pressed down hard, branches snapped and pushed aside, not broken by weather but by repeated use. I followed it for a short distance before stopping. I saw scraps of plastic, rusted metal, and an old tarp partially buried under leaves. The smell was strong there, oil, old food, and something worse that I couldn't place. I went back to the cabin and stayed inside the rest of the day. I packed my things slowly, telling myself I would leave in the morning. That night, the sounds came back, closer than before. Footsteps circled the cabin again, slower this time. There was a pause at the door. I could feel the weight on the porch. The handle did not move, but the door frame shifted slightly, as if tested. The footsteps moved to the side of the cabin, stopped near the window, then moved away. I didn't sleep at all. Morning came gray and cold. Fog sat low between the trees, thick enough to hide anything more than a few yards away. I loaded my car quickly, keeping my eyes on the forest. As I walked back to the cabin for the last bag, I noticed something carved into the side of the porch post. Shallow lines, uneven and rushed. Not words, just marks, too high up to be from animals. I got in the car and started driving. The road felt longer than before. The forest seemed endless, the turns unfamiliar. A fallen tree blocked part of the road ahead, not completely, but enough to force a slow pass. As I edged around it, I saw fresh cut marks on the trunk, clean and recent. That's when I knew this wasn't random. I kept driving without stopping until the road widened and the trees thinned. When I reached a town hours later, I went straight to the nearest ranger station. I didn't tell a dramatic story. I just reported signs of illegal activity and possible squatters on remote land. The ranger listened carefully and took notes. I left the state the next day. Weeks later, I read a short article online. It mentioned an arrest in a remote forest area near the border. Illegal operations, hidden camps, stolen supplies, and a long-term presence that had gone unnoticed for years. The photo showed a section of forest that looked too familiar. The article said the cabin nearby had been quietly removed. I never went back. I never rented another place that far from people again. Some places are empty for a reason, and silence can hide more than peace. I was 29 when this happened, in the fall of 2014, a year when I was doing seasonal survey work for a small forestry contractor. My job kept me moving between counties, checking old plots and marking storm damage. I spent most days alone, walking miles of timber, writing notes, taking photos, and driving back roads that barely showed up on maps. That is how I found the cabin. It sat far off a logging spur that had not been used in years. The road was more mud than gravel, with young trees growing up through the center. I parked when the truck could not go any farther and walked the rest. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold dirt. The forest was quiet in that dull way that comes right before winter, when even birds seem to save their energy. I noticed the cabin because the roofline cut through the trees at an odd angle, like something sinking back into the ground. Up close, it looked older than I expected. The logs were gray and soft at the corners. Moss filled the gaps where chinking used to be. One side of the roof had sagged so much that rainwater must have pooled there for years. The door hung open, twisted on one hinge. No tracks around it were fresh, but the ground was packed down in places, like people had walked the same path again and again over time. That stuck with me. I did not plan to go inside. I only wanted to take a few photos and mark it on my map. But when I stood at the door and looked in, I saw that it was dry inside, cleaner than I expected, and something about that pulled me forward. The light was dim, but I could see the shape of a table, a stove, and shelves along the wall. The air smelled old but not rotten. It smelled like dust, cold metal, and stale wood smoke. The floor creaked under my boots, slow and deep, like the cabin was tired of holding weight. I moved carefully, scanning corners, checking the ceiling for signs of collapse. There were old tools on the wall, rusted but placed neatly. A lantern sat on the table, empty but clean. The stove door was closed, and when I touched it, it left a clear print in the dust. Someone had been there not that long ago. I felt uneasy then, but not scared enough to leave. I told myself it was probably a hunting cabin that still saw use now and then. People came and went. That explained the packed ground and the clean surfaces. I took my photos and stepped back outside. The sky had darkened more than I realized. Low clouds rolled in, thick and fast, and the wind picked up, shaking the tops of the trees. The rain started hard and cold. Within minutes, the road I came in on turned into a mess I did not trust. I stood there, soaked, weighing my options. The cabin was solid enough for shelter. I decided to wait it out. That choice is the one that still sits heavy with me. Inside, the sound of rain on the roof was loud, uneven, like fingers drumming with no rhythm. Water found its way through gaps and dripped onto the floor in slow, steady beats. I set my pack down and stood still, listening. The cabin made small noises as it shifted in the wind. Nothing else moved. As it got darker, details came out in the low light that I missed before. Scratches on the inside of the door, deep and rough, not made by animals. The shelves held cans with labels peeled away, some empty, some not. There was a pile of blankets in the corner, pressed flat, like they had been slept on many times. The smell changed as the air cooled. Under the dust and old smoke was a faint, sour human smell. My stomach tightened. I walked to the back of the cabin and found a second room, smaller with no windows. The floor there was cleaner, swept. A narrow mattress lay against the wall. Above it, nailed into a beam, was a strip of cloth tied into a loop. I did not touch it. I did not need to. I knew enough to understand it was not there by accident. The rain turned to a steady downpour. Light faded to almost nothing. I stayed near the door, my pack on my back, ready to leave if I had to. I kept listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything that did not belong to the cabin itself. Time stretched in a way that made my thoughts loud and sharp. Every creak sounded like movement. Every gust felt like something pushing from the outside. Then I smelled smoke. It was faint at first, just a hint, like someone had struck a match far away. I scanned the room. The stove was cold. There was no fire. The smell grew stronger, mixed with damp wood and old ash. It did not come from the stove. It came from the back room. I moved slowly, keeping my weight light. In the back room, I saw it. A metal drum cut in half, hidden behind a stack of boards. Inside were blackened scraps of wood and something else, something that did not burn clean. The smell was wrong, heavy, sweet and sharp at the same time. I felt dizzy, not from fumes, but from understanding. This cabin was not abandoned. It was used, maybe still used. The person who used it knew this land, knew these roads, and counted on no one coming this far unless they had a reason. I had no way to know if they were close or how often they came back. The rain eased up after dark. The forest outside was black and thick, but I trusted it more than the cabin. I eased the door open and stepped out. That is when I saw the wire. It was thin, almost invisible in the low light, stretched between two trees at chest height, right where I would have walked if I had not stopped. I followed it with my eyes. It wrapped around the cabin, a rough perimeter, tied and twisted in places, loose in others. Simple, crude, but placed with care. I backed away slowly, heart pounding so hard it hurt. I did not run. I took wide steps, watching the ground, the trees, the spaces between. I moved downhill, away from the road, trusting my sense of direction more than the map. My boots filled with water. Branches scraped my arms and face. I did not stop. After what felt like hours, I hit the creek I crossed earlier that day. The sound of water grounded me. I followed it until the land opened and the road appeared through the trees. My truck was still there. Nothing touched it. I drove away without looking back. I reported the cabin the next day to the local ranger office, gave them the location, the details, everything. They took it seriously. Weeks later, I heard through work channels that they found evidence of long-term illegal use, trapping equipment, stolen property, and signs of animal processing done in unsafe ways. No one was caught right away, but the cabin was torn down and the area monitored. What stayed with me was not just the fear of that night, but how normal it all looked at first. How easy it was to mistake use for abandonment, quiet for safety. Even now, years later, when I pass an old structure in the woods, I keep my distance. I trust my first instinct. Some places are not empty. They are waiting, and they do not care who wanders in by mistake. I was 34 years old when I stayed alone at that farm cabin, and it still feels strange to even write about it. This happened in late October of 2014, in a quiet farming area outside a small town in eastern Nebraska. The land had been in my family years before, passed down and sold off piece by piece. The cabin was the last thing left. It sat far from the main road, surrounded by open fields, old fences, and patches of dead corn stalks that never fully got cleared away. The cabin was small and basic. One main room, a narrow kitchen area, a tiny bathroom, and a bedroom that smelled like dust and old wood. The boards creaked even when I stood still. The wind always found its way through the cracks, making the walls groan at night. There was no cell service. Electricity worked, but the lights flickered when the wind picked up. I came out there to clean it up and decide whether to sell it or tear it down. I planned to stay 3 nights. The first day felt normal enough. Cold air, gray sky, and the sound of the fields moving in the wind. I spent hours clearing trash, sweeping mouse droppings, and airing the place out. I noticed small things that bothered me but did not scare me yet. Boot prints near the old barn that did not match mine. A section of fence pushed down that I knew had been upright last year. The barn door hung open, banging slowly even when the wind stopped. That night, I locked the cabin door and went to bed early. The mattress was thin and stiff. I could hear rats or mice in the walls. Around midnight, I woke up because the silence felt wrong. No wind, no insects, just a heavy stillness. Then I heard slow footsteps outside. Not fast, not sneaky, just steady steps moving through dry dirt. They circled the cabin once. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. After a few minutes, the steps stopped near the front porch. I heard the wood creak under weight. Then nothing. No knocking, no door handle moving. Eventually, I fell back asleep without realizing it. The next morning, I checked the porch. There were clear boot prints. Big, deep impressions like someone heavy had stood there for a while. They faced the door. I felt uneasy but told myself it could have been a local farmer checking the property. Still, nobody around there had any reason to come that close. That day, I worked on the barn. Inside, the smell was strong, like oil, rust, and rot. Old tools were scattered on a workbench that I remembered being empty years ago. Someone had been using the place. I found food wrappers behind hay bales, fresh ones. I told myself I would finish my work quickly and leave early the next day. That evening, the sky turned dark fast. Clouds rolled in low and thick. Wind picked up and pushed against the cabin like it wanted inside. I cooked a simple meal and sat near the window watching the fields. That is when I noticed movement near the fence line. A figure stood there, far enough that I could not see details, but close enough to know it was a person. They stood still for a long time, not moving at all. No flashlight, no phone light, just standing there. I turned off the cabin lights and watched from the dark. The figure slowly started walking toward the barn, then disappeared behind it. I waited for sounds. Nothing came. No footsteps, no doors, just wind again. That night was worse. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping. Came from the barn. Slow, dragging sounds like someone pulling something heavy across concrete. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would wake the whole place. I did not look outside. I stayed in bed until morning, barely breathing, listening until the sound stopped. In the morning, I found the barn door wide open. Inside, tools had been moved again. A ladder was pulled out and left in the middle of the floor. Something felt off in a way I could not explain. It felt planned, like someone wanted me to notice. I decided to leave that day. I packed my things quickly. While loading my truck, I noticed fresh tire tracks near the cabin that were not mine. They led toward the back fields, not the road. Whoever it was did not want to be seen coming or going. Before leaving, I did one last walk through the cabin to make sure nothing was left behind. That is when I noticed the bedroom window. The lock was broken. The window frame had small scratches on it, like someone had been opening it from the outside over and over again. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been close, very close, close enough to watch me sleep. As I stepped outside with my last bag, I heard movement in the cornfield. Heavy movement, fast now. I dropped everything and ran for my truck. I did not look back. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I saw someone standing near the edge of the field, tall, thin, wearing dark clothes covered in dirt. Their head was tilted slightly, like they were studying me. I drove straight to town and did not stop until I reached a gas station with people around. I reported what happened to local authorities. They searched the area later that day. A week after I left, I got a call. They found a makeshift shelter hidden deep in the fields behind the barn. Old blankets, empty cans, a journal with dates going back months. The entries described watching the cabin, learning my schedule, writing about when the lights went off and when I slept. No name, no explanation, just observations. The person was never found. I sold the property as it was, cheap, without ever stepping foot there again. Years later, I still think about how close that situation came to something worse. There were no ghosts, no monsters, no stories passed down. Just a person who decided that empty land was theirs, and that I was in the way. That makes it harder to forget, because it was real, and whoever it was could still be out there, watching some other quiet place where nobody thinks to look.